right, so let's get started. I have to say, my name is Jeff Maggioncalda, and I'm really grateful that you're here today. I've been a CEO for a long time, and it's something I actually really enjoy, and I've learned a lot, and it doesn't make me really a master, but at least I can share with you some of the things I've learned, good and bad, over a long history. And I put a little extra into this. This is a presentation I've given at various business schools and things, but for this group, I was like, I want to do something special. So I have something special I want to try out that I'm excited about, so I'm glad there's an audience for it. So my job as a CEO, it's not called the job of a growth CEO, because I don't know how other people should be growth company CEOs. I just know how I have done it, and I've done it haltingly. I have faltered many times. I've had many situations during my career where the board has literally said, we're going to fire you unless you can do X, Y, Z. So it's been really quite a journey. I started when I was 27. I was the CEO of Financial Engines, which is a company started by two Stanford professors, Bill Sharp, who's a Nobel Prize winner, and Joe Grinfest, who is a former SEC commissioner. And they didn't want to quit their job, so they said, we need a young person who's kind of dumb to take a big risk to write a business plan, try to get it funded. And you know, at the time, I had never hired somebody. I had never fired somebody. I was a student, and I did a little bit of consulting. So I learned about this job somewhat painfully for my team over a long history. I was 18 years at Financial Engines. About 13 years in, we went public. We finally got product market fit, and it took off, and it was a beautiful thing after a lot of zigging and zagging. And literally, there's a Stanford Business School case about Financial Engines, which talks about our 5 pivots, 5 different business models before we found something that really met a market need. And then I took a couple years off, and I spent some time with my daughters, and I traveled with my wife. And it was really fun, and it was nice to be able to spend time thinking about, what was that experience I just had for 18 years? And what do I understand about the world and culture and people? I was an English major. You'll see during the presentation, there's a lot of humanities kinds of stuff. And then I got the chance to work for Coursera about 2 years ago, and it has been really thrilling. And also not totally, I know exactly what I'm doing. So please consider this as sort of a toolkit that I've put together. I've shared with various audiences. Doesn't mean it works for everybody, but literally, when I talk to CEOs who are like, what tips would you give me? I often send this presentation. I say, this is the best that I know how to do at this job. So the job my job as a growth company CEO is to grow the company. And the key to doing that is learning and changing. So it's a constant loop of getting feedback, saying, what does the world need from our business? What does the team need from me? How do I need to change and become better? And so part of it is certainly growing the company, but I would say that for any aspiring CEO, get ready to grow yourself, because you're going to be wrong, you're going to make mistakes, you're going to suffer isolation and feelings of inadequacy and all kinds of stuff. It's not as fun as people make it seem. And I would say if you're not up for a serious personal journey, then don't do it, because I think you'll only be good if you can be open-minded and get a lot of feedback and realize that you're never good enough for the job. You just have to hope that you can learn and change fast enough. I'm on the board of Silicon Valley Bank as well, and I've invested in a lot of companies, so I often give CEO reviews. They don't really like it because I have a certain way that I think about the job. But I think that the job of a growth company CEO is to learn, change, and grow as an organization, as an individual. Tool number 1 that a CEO has is strategy, which is a choice about where you're choosing to compete and whose problems you're choosing to solve. Choice number 2 is team, which is how do you assemble the team of people that will be in your company, starting with the executive team. Number 3 is culture, which is how do you create an environment where you can attract diverse people and have them believe in some common objective with enough clarity that they can efficiently align and execute against a plan of action. And then finally, the idea is that those things produce performance. And so a CEO, if all they do is set great strategy and have a great team and a really healthy culture, and they don't perform, you're not doing your job. So whenever I evaluate myself, and every 90 days we do our OKRs at Coursera, my categories of OKRs are always those 4 categories. When I evaluate Greg Becker, I'm on the comp committee at Silicon Valley Bank. They have all these forms I'm supposed to fill out. I just type an email and I just do this. I say, look, this is just the way I think about it. And I would say it took me a long time to figure out that that's my job. You know, my job is not designing the product. My job is not getting involved in all the things I love to do. Because if I'm doing those things, I'm not doing these things. And if I'm not doing these things, nobody's doing these things. So as a younger CEO, I was often too indulgent in things I enjoyed. And it wasn't until I was a little bit older and I realized this is what the company needs me to do. And even if I don't want to be doing these things and something seems more interesting, this is the duty of my job. And so this is what I'm going to focus on. So this little talk is going to be, it's quite practical. It is literally the key pieces of how I set strategy, build a team, set culture. And we'll talk a little bit about performance and results. So on strategy, I went to Stanford Business School. I worked at McKinsey, did a lot of strategy stuff. And a lot of that's very long. And so I thought, what's the simplest way to describe it? Because strategy is important as a company to figure out what choices you're making. So I think it's really about focusing your choices. So I always start with the customer. And literally, if I want to evaluate a company's strategy, I always think, whose problem are you solving? Whose problem are you solving? And how intimately do you understand what the unmet need is? And how compelling is your solution to meeting that need? So that's, I always start with the customer. Then I say, that's not it. And there are a lot of people back in the day like, Jeff, if you just build best product, the best product wins. Wrong. The best product does not always win. TiVo was one of the best products I had ever used, and it did not become a multi-billion-dollar, $10 billion company. There are many companies with great products, but that's not enough. The second thing is the opportunity. So choose a clear problem in a big growing market. So if you added up all those customers, you said, well, how many are there? And how much are they willing to pay you, and how fast is it growing? Are there tailwinds behind you? I love tailwinds. Tailwinds are kind of trends that make it more likely that you're going to succeed than fail. And one of the ways I kind of think about that is if you're like out on a surfboard and you kind of look back, the size of the wave is kind of the opportunity behind you. And there's some opportunities that are just so big, and I think ed tech is one of them right now, that you don't have to be like an expert surfer. Just don't fall off the surfboard. Just get yourself lined up with really big opportunities and then do a decent job, and you have a bigger chance of success than if you try to build a great company where there's just not that many tailwinds behind you. And then the final piece, which is just important, is you got to look at the economics, the unit economics, what is the marginal revenue that someone's going to pay me for the service? And what is the marginal cost of providing that service at scale? There's got to be some spread there. Now, in the day one, you don't necessarily need to know what the economics are, because sometimes you might not know exactly how you're planning to make money, but at some point, you're going to have to figure that out. So customer opportunity, and then finally, advantage. So choose a clear problem in a big growing market where you have a long-term unfair advantage. Because if you do a really great job, there are a lot of other smart, well-capitalized people, they'll copy you. And even if they're just as good or not quite as good, they'll underprice you, and it will still destroy, for your company, the economics, and just give a huge economic benefit to society, which is great, but you won't necessarily have a really big business unless you can do something that other people can't copy. So strategy, I say, is finding the combination of the customer problem that represents a big growing opportunity where you have some advantage. And a lot of people like to just do, wow, look at how big the opportunity is. Yeah, but what's our advantage? But we're so good at this. But is that really relevant to the customer? Anyway, let me keep going. I'm already going way too long. Product market fit. People talk about product market fit. So great book I recommend. I'll mention a couple books if you're interested. Friend Dan Olson wrote a book called Lean Product Playbook. It's very simple. Start with a customer. For us, we start with a learner. And I say target learner because you can't serve everybody's needs. So you have to pick, whose needs am I going to solve, and how intimately do I understand what that underserved need is. That's kind of the market part. And then the product is really just a stack of what's the value proposition that you make to someone, the promise or the benefit that you're claiming, and the way you pitch it matters a lot. The feature set and functionality, and then the user experience, what it actually feels like to be using it. And so product market fit, I think, really is, that's the product, what's your pitch, what's your product, what's the experience like, that's the market, which is a special type of customer who has a special problem, and then the fit is just like, how well do they connect? Can you 9 out of 10 times say, yeah, if I know that if you're this kind of a person, you're going to love my product and buy it 9 out of 10 times, without without any uncertainty. So that's really simple, but this is really, really important. And we like to say in my company, don't scale it till you nail it. You really got to figure out that product market fit before you really scale up. Otherwise, it could potentially fall apart. Another thing with strategy is I'm in this group called YPO, Young Presidents Organization. I'm 50, so I'm getting booted out because I'm really not young anymore. But I've been in it for like 15 years. And we had this exercise once where we all talked as CEOs around what's the most important trait of a CEO. And at least among this group, what they said, what we all kind of said, almost unanimously, was systems thinking. Now, that's like, what are you talking about? If you want to have a scalable business, unless you just get lucky, you want to think of it as a system. There's a great book called Business Model Generation by this guy, Osterwalder. I forgot his first name. But it's really, really good. It has been maybe the best business tool I've used in business so far. And here's how it works. So this is with credit to that book. Start with this is the way I look at a business as a system. Start with the customer, and who is that customer? Then you have a value proposition, which is the claim that you make and the actual service, the benefit that you offer. You have to reach the customer through some acquisition channels. Once you get the customer, you have to service that customer with some kind of a servicing model. In the book, they call this the front stage, the stuff that the customer touches and learns and feels. So that's really a really important part. It's not just the customer, it's not just your product, it's not just your acquisition channels, it's not just your servicing relationship. The backstage is the key activities that all the people in your company are doing to produce that stuff. Those are verbs. The key resources, these are nouns, things that you have. They could be money, they could be people, they could be brands, they could be a customer base, they could be special insights that give you an advantage. Inevitably, especially nowadays, you have partners, people who supply inputs to this process. The backstage has costs associated with it. There's fixed and variable costs. I worry way more about the variable costs because those are the ones that don't change so much at scale. In a big opportunity where there's a good, healthy, efficient capital market, covering upfront fixed costs is not that difficult. It's the marginal cost at scale that matters. And then finally, there's the revenue, which is how do you make money? So when I think of business as a system, I look at all these different pieces. And when I first came to Coursera, literally I started on a Monday, and by Thursday, we were already starting a process. I had written basically 30 questions for each of the components of the business model. And rather than asking individuals to come and meet me individually, kind of one-on-one, I got all my direct reports and all of their direct reports, and I said, we're all going to learn about this business together. So I delegated these questions to different people who own these different parts of the business, and we all went through and we learned about how the business works, and then we evaluated what are the strengths and weaknesses of our business model. So what are the positives and negatives about our customers? What are the positives and negatives about our key partners, our economics, et cetera? So then when you get to the question of, will your business scale? Here's how I think about that question, which if you're a growth CEO, you have to be thinking, can this thing scale? If you think about it as a system, just think, where's the bottleneck? And the thing about bottlenecks is in a system, the bottlenecks usually don't stay in the same place. You elevate a bottleneck and it's no longer the bottleneck, and then something else becomes the bottleneck. And then you elevate that bottleneck. When I say you elevate it, it means you put time and attention on it, you make sure that's not the limiting factor, then something else becomes the limiting factor. So the first question I ask is, are customers going to be the bottleneck to growing 10 times bigger? Are there enough customers out there? How big is the market? Do they want to buy our service? It's a changing target because the competition is always trying to steal your competitors. So you have to always be doing this. Every year we do a 3-year vision. I'll talk about this too in a sec, where we update our view. Every year we look at a new 3-year view, and the competition makes this a very dynamic environment. Will the product bottleneck your 10 times growth? Do you have enough features? Do you have enough functionality to please your customers to grow 10 times? And again, competition is creating their products. So the competition might be creating features that you didn't plan to create, but you need to create those features in order to keep up. Will your acquisition channels be the bottleneck? Will your organization be the bottleneck? Do you have the right org structure? Do you have the right leadership team? Do you have the right systems and processes? I needed to be there. Do you have the right systems and processes? There's a lot of times where the bottleneck moves, and often when you start growing really quickly, like when you get product market fit and you grow quickly, organizational issues often become the bottleneck. And then a final thing I just put on is just, will your operating leverage improve with 10 times growth? So this isn't really a bottleneck, but you really want it to be the case that your costs don't grow as quickly with scale as your revenues. That's how your profitability increases over time. This is often referred to as operating leverage, which is how do your margins expand as you get bigger. If you have fixed costs and not much variable costs, and you have variable revenues, then your revenues will get bigger and your costs won't move as quickly. So generally, fixed cost businesses are the ones that have really nice operating leverage. Now, to create a learning organization, you need feedback loops. And so I also look at this and I say, all right, so if we need to know what do we learn, how do we change in order to grow, same's true for the company. So you have to institutionalize your feedback loops. Number one feedback loop is with customers. So I'd say in any company, I'd be like, where are your customer feedback loops? How can you ensure that you're always getting good, unbiased data from your customers? Behavior, quantitative, and also qualitative. Number two is your employees. Where are the institutional mechanisms to always be getting feedback from your employees? Employee pulse surveys are a great idea. 360 reviews at least annually are a great idea. Skip level meetings so that I have meetings with my direct reports at least once a quarter. You really want to make sure there are institutionalized feedback loops with employees. You want to always be systematically looking at competition. So I think about competition as like a really great source of learning. Because there's all these other companies with super smart people and lots of funding, and they're doing things and they're running experiments. So a fun thing to do is go to that time machine on the internet and see how your competitors' websites are changing over time. Because they're not doing it randomly. So if you actually intentionally watch your competition, you can get pretty good ideas of what's working and what's not working. You can think about what that might mean for you. Partners are a really important source. They're providing you the inputs, but they often provide their inputs to a lot of other people. So I often ask partners, how do you view Coursera? How are we different than some of the other people that you provide your services to? And they'll give you often really good results, good answers. And then investors also are really helpful as well. So institutional feedback loops are critical. And just make sure that it gets to especially the executive team. So on team, the most important thing is to recruit a team with the potential to grow. This is just me, but I try to always find values, talent, teamwork, performance. And I won't read through what that means. The harder things, the more concrete things like performance are usually easier to assess. Like, tell me a time when. Tell me a time when. The ones that are kind of hard are the ones that really measure someone's self-awareness and adaptability to change. My favorite question I ever invented, which I use all the time, so if you like it, you can steal it for sure. It's, how are you most misunderstood? And this question just befuddles people. Because they're like, never read that one before. And they're like, okay, first of all, what do I think is the truth? And then second of all, like, do I want to admit that that's the truth? And oftentimes it comes with emotion. It's usually not a clinical answer. It's like, well, people say that I'm bossy. And you're like, tell me more. Or I will say, well, how are you really? And then I say, well, why do you think people misunderstand you? It really gets this question of self-awareness and whether people actually are asking for feedback on themselves and how they feel about that feedback. So Rich, who's our head of people in the back here, says feedback is a gift. And there are certain people who believe that, and there are certain people who I probably say that they believe it, but it's hard for certain people to get feedback on themselves. But if you find people who do, they have a great chance of being able to grow with the business. Another one that is useful is how many people have you fired? And people are like, that's kind of not very nice. But if they haven't fired anybody, they haven't really been in very senior positions. And if they had, there's a question of how did that come about? How did you do it? How do you treat people when you're delivering maybe the worst news that they've had in their professional careers? What impact did it have on you? When you went home that night, what did you talk with your spouse about? I mean, so there's a human piece of this that even though it sounds like a pretty hard question, that's when the stakes are really high. Sometimes people will blame it on somebody else. Well, I fired him, but I didn't really want to because someone else told me to. But you can get a lot of, if you think carefully about the kinds of questions you ask, and I do agree with the tell me about a time, there's a lot you can learn about people. Anyway, that's what I look at. The leadership team needs to model the way teams perform, not just as individuals, but collectively. There's a great book called 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. I love it. They also have some great instruments so you can evaluate your teamwork. They basically say the first dysfunction, this is Patrick Lencioni, he says the first dysfunction is the absence of trust, which is the foundation to anything else. The absence of trust creates a fear of conflict. Because I don't really know if I can trust you, I don't want to say something that's going to get us in a fight because I don't know where that's going to go. A fear of conflict means I'm not going to really be committed because I didn't really tell you what I thought in the first place. This was kind of a dumb idea. We decided to do it. Not my problem. I'm not into it. Lack of commitment means hey, I'm not accountable if I never really signed up to this emotionally. Lack of accountability, you can imagine, does not produce good results. So what he says is these are the dysfunctions. If you have a team built on trust that engages in conflict, has commitment, accountability, and results, that's great. What does a leader need to do? And the CEO needs to do this. And by the way, I don't do this as well as I want to, but this is what I want to do better. A CEO can first be vulnerable. Talk about uncertainty. Talk about times that you're scared. Talk about times when you screwed up. Talk about, apologize to people. If you get feedback, tell everybody, yeah, I got this feedback and I want to do better for the company. Conflict, if you think that there's false agreements, get it on the table. So you know what, we really want to hammer this out. So demanding debate for the team, forcing clarity and closure on issues, confronting difficult issues. There's another great book called Crucial Conversations. Love that book. It's about how to talk about things that are usually very emotional. And then finally, focus on not just results, but team results. So another big thing I often say when you're on the exec team is your first team. Your second team is your organizational function. But if we as a team don't grow this company, nobody will. And so we are really the first team that needs to take full accountability and be responsible for the results. So even if someone has an accountability to drive result on the team, the whole team always needs to be thinking, what can we be doing to drive better results? It's not about the individual, it's about the team. In terms of the feedback loops, I mentioned performance reviews. We do performance reviews twice a year, written once a year. They're 360. So you get reviewed by your peers, your direct reports, and your manager. And these are the three categories. It's pretty simple. How have you performed against your goals? What do other people say is your impact on them and their ability to want to get their work done and get their work done? And then the third one is growth, which is how much have you demonstrated a commitment to growing and becoming a better person? And a lot of that is humility, and a lot of it is asking for feedback and demonstrating an ability to change as a person and to grow as a person. All right, culture. So this is just my definition, but I was traveling around. My wife and I had the pleasure of spending 2 years of going to all sorts of countries and seeing all kinds of wonderful things. And I became really interested in kind of what is common about humanity. And so if you look at culture and even elements of culture like architecture, like music, like language, like sports, you can start seeing where things are similar and where things are different. And so my kind of definition is, not just in the business context, but just like in the world, culture is the beliefs and behaviors that transmit and reinforce group identity and longevity. The reason that this is useful in a business context is I think it becomes pretty useful to think about in a company, which is this sort of twin pillars of belief and behavior. So on the belief side, of course, you want to have a purpose. Why are we here? A vision. What does the future look like if we're successful? Values. How do we go about this? Language and symbols are very important. And I was an English major, so my special fun little part is coming up here on language. I think language is really, really important. And of course, you can say all you want and you can write it all down. But if the experience of people in the company doesn't make them believe that that is truly what the values of the company are and what the real beliefs are, then obviously there's going to be a big disconnect, which can obviously breed cynicism and discontent. So it's important to know what people perceive. It's important to know what you say, and you want to try to minimize the gap in between. So on the behaviors, these are not all of them, but as I walk into a company and I think about what we need to make sure really works, I think the number one thing, and it's going to sound a little bit vague, and it is a little bit vague, but how do people treat each other? Do people treat each other with respect? Do they listen? Do they interrupt each other? Do people bully? How does it feel to be an employee at the company? A second one is who is rewarded and for what? So obviously reward and recognition is important. Doing it in a public space is important. When you do it in a public space, people pay attention to who is getting promoted, who is getting the raise, who is getting that award. And a lot of times people will fill in the narrative as to why. Oh, they were promoted because they know so-and-so. That's a very common reaction, is people will think that people get promoted because of who they know. Of course, there is some bias in how transparent someone's performance is, but that's a really important one. How you decide, and especially how you decide on what we're going to do and who's going to get the resources. That's a real important one. Because you have hundreds of people in your company, and ultimately, the strategy dictates what you're going to work on. That has an impact on every single person. And resourcing, hiring more people or buying that system has a big impact on people. So that's a really important behavior. Learning from failure, learning generally, but especially from, quote, failure. And people often say in Silicon Valley, we celebrate failure. I don't. I celebrate learning. And turns out failure could be a great way to learn. Failure in and of itself is not fun, and honestly, it's not even good. It's horrible. But if you really think about it, if you just flat out failed and nothing came of it, it's just lousy. Unless one thinks that suffering leads to transcendence, maybe there's something very special about that. But generally speaking, you want to learn from your failures. You also want to learn from your successes. And I find too often there's unconscious competence and unconscious incompetence. Ideally, you'd be conscious. You'd know why you didn't succeed, and you'd know why you succeeded so that you can replicate that. And then who gets recruited? I just had to tack that on, because who you're bringing into the organization is definitely going to have a big impact on the behaviors. OK, here's my favorite little part that I added. There's a great book I read recently. I recommend it. It's a little dense, as you could probably see from the quote. But it's one of the foremost philosophers. I've been interested in sort of the emergence of human consciousness. Science is solving so many problems, but human consciousness is a tricky one. So this guy, Daniel Dennett, wrote this book, From Bacteria to Bach and Back, The Evolution of Minds. And he takes a very Darwinian natural selection approach to the evolution of human consciousness. And he talks about language. And he says, language expands our individual cognitive powers by providing a medium for uniting them with all the cognitive powers of every clever human being who has ever thought. And I was like, that's a really good quote, but it's pretty dense. So I totally agree with it. And I think as a CEO, commanding language and words is very important. And I put this together this little game to sort of explain what I think Dennett's trying to get at. So take a look at this set of words. I just put a bunch of words up on the grid. And as you think about these words, think about the way that a word evokes a concept. And when you're doing that, by the way, there's something actually happening. I see Barb Oakley in the back there. There's something happening in your brain. That word and that token of meaning lives in your brain through a set of connections. So look at some of these things and just see what comes up. And then if I say rebels, think in your mind, what idea comes to mind when you think of the word rebels? And then if I added a word, rebels destroy. Think about that idea. What comes to mind? Is that a novel idea? Is that kind of an obvious idea? And then we add another word. Rebels destroy things. And ask yourself, OK, what does that look like? And is that a novel idea? And then if I said, well, rebels destroy people, how different, one word change, how different is that from the previous idea that was generated by just these three words? You're like, OK, Jeff, where are you going with this? This is boring. Rebels destroy ideas. Now what does that look like? And is that something that seems a little bit more novel? And the thing that I'm trying to really suggest is that words are very powerful because of the relationship to ideas. And ideas are perhaps the most powerful thing that humans invented. So an obvious idea is that words express ideas. So I would definitely say that a CEO should have some command of language and words, because words are the vehicle that we use to express ideas. And you're like, yeah, I knew that. Like, that's not very interesting. But what about words make ideas? What about the idea that words actually give rise to ideas in your mind that never existed before? So they are actually idea builders, and they themselves are responsible for the creation of ideas. And if you're like, maybe, but I think the idea that words make ideas was already in my mind, I'd be like, well, how about words infect ideas? Now that's a concept that's probably not totally novel, but think about one of the incredible phenomena that's happening right now, where you have an idea of a person, and then some other person in power just puts a nickname, one adjective, on the front of that person's name. And it kind of catches. And you don't want it to be there, but now it's in your brain, and it's infected your idea of that person. So I would suggest that words are very powerful because words make ideas contagious. So words can express ideas. Words can create ideas from whole cloth. And the key thing is when they infect other people, they make those ideas contagious. And I would argue that idea contagion is maybe the most powerful tool that a CEO has to building a scalable business. You need to have some vision about the way the world might look. You want to have an idea about the product, an idea about your customer, ideas about your strategy. You want to recruit people. You want to align people. You want to reward people. You want your company to mean something in the minds of many, many people, your partners, your customers, your employees, the world in general. So I would say that a major reason why CEOs should have a good command of language and meaning is because they're in the business of idea contagion, and words make ideas contagious. All right, I don't know what you guys thought of that, but I thought that was fun. All right, so boring stuff, back to boring stuff. So in terms of setting strategy, we like to have OKRs. Every 90 days, we set on one page the key objectives and key results that are measurable, that the whole company is working on. Has to fit on one page. Each item can only be one line long. You have to have, we have a template that we fill out. Every 90 days, we're looking out 90 days. Every year, we do the annual financial plan where we look out for a calendar year, and that's when we do our resourcing. That cascades down into the functional groups as well. And then every spring, we do the annual financial plan. In the fall, we always look out to the next year. And then in the spring, we always look out 3 years. So every year, we update our view of what things look like 3 years out. And it's just a really useful way to make sure that people are totally focused on their results, and they're focused on the next year, and they're actually looking further out there and outside the company to what's happening around us and where things are heading so that we cannot be blindsided by something bad or miss a great opportunity to really grow the business. Talk a little bit about culture and results. So I like to say that activities produce deliverables, produce results. It is just a human instinct, I think, that since we spend our days every day doing things, we often summarize to our manager or the board or whatever, like, this is what we did. And I do like to recognize hard work, but it's way more important what you produced, and even more important what result that produced. So I like to really focus on results. I like to celebrate deliverables because I think creation is really wonderful and is gratifying. Activities are kind of good hard work, but they don't, sometimes they get in the way. In fact, I think that one of the things people do is they often kind of do the opposite. They put a premium on working really hard. What they really should be doing, especially as an executive team, is you should be finding leverage, which is, how do I maximize the amount of output per unit of input? There's a phenomenon I call grinding. Grinding out growth is when you're just working so hard to produce that incremental amount of growth. It's because you don't have leverage. You haven't figured out a way through that business model to figure out how do I, with relatively few activities and deliverables, really produce a lot of results. And so I think an exec team really needs to be finding leverage. And the way to find leverage is, I think, a process which I might call, I think sometimes people call design thinking. This is also from Lean Product Playbook. Well, a lot of product managers do this, but I think this is just a good way to learn in life. And I'm a real nerd, but I try to do this all the time. So the first thing is, what result am I trying to produce? And what is my hypothesis about how to produce it? Where might I get leverage? Where might I, if I do this, then I'll get this, and I'll get a lot of the output per unit of input. So it starts with an hypothesis. In neurobiology, they sometimes call it a credence. It's a belief or expectation about what's going to happen. Then what you do is you design a prototype. And I put minimum viable prototype as opposed to product because I think in all stages of life, prototyping things is really useful. Finding a facsimile of what you're trying to test that's much cheaper and getting feedback on your hypothesis is really valuable. So I like to always do the MVP on the design side. And then you want to find the fastest, cheapest way to test it to get a valid signal back. But a big mistake a lot of companies make is they'll design something because it's cool, but they won't really know what it's trying to drive. Or they'll know what they're trying to drive, and then they build the whole thing perfectly, and they hope that it works. But there's really a blend of, here's what we're trying to do, here's a quick way that we could test it, and then, of course, you want to look at this and you want to learn from it. So it's not just what happened when we ran this test, but why did it happen? That gives you a hint as to how you might then update your hypothesis. But this loop of having a clear hypothesis, developing quick prototypes to test them, testing them and then learning from them, doing debriefs, retrospectives is really important. And my wife thinks, like I said, I'm kind of crazy because you could do this with relationships. You could do this with your fitness. You can do this with nutrition. You could do this with almost anything. You can say, I want to have a different result in my life. Like my wife said the other day, she was saying how much better our relationship has been. I was really happy. And I said, well, why has it been better? She's like, don't ask why it got better. Just like, it's better. Let's be happy about it. I said, but I want it to keep happening. And if I don't know how it happened, I might not be able to keep it this way. So I think, then she's like, go to. But I think this is really a valuable way to learn. Fundamentally, at its heart, this is like the scientific method. So I think it's useful. In terms of results, we measure results the same way. We have our key metrics. We measure it over time. And so we start with something we call a plan. These are the results that you commit to. Again, these are just little tricks of the trade. These are especially over the course of a year, I commit that this metric will be at this target level each month. Then you measure the actuals, which is what levels of performance have we actually produced against these key metrics. Not all metrics, just the key ones. And then I always like to see what we call the forecast, which is your best estimate of where we're going to end up the year. And what's interesting about this is, and we do almost all of our metrics look like this, but you can immediately look at these, you can look at the shape of the curves, you can see which is up, under, you can see how they're bending, and you can really learn a lot. The point I will make is that learning is the key to driving long-term results, which means that learning is often more important than short-term results. If I could either have a chart where the blue line of actual was above the plan but kind of was flattish, the dotted line was flattish, like, yeah, we beat the plan, but we're not really figuring out how to get leverage, versus one where it was lower than the plan, but it was bending upwards like this, I'd take this every day of the week. Because fundamentally, you're trying to figure out over the long term how you're really going to grow this business, and do you understand, and is it predictable, how you're going to do that. So when people think about IPO, they think about predictability. When I think about predictability, I think about a business model that generates results that are predictable enough that you have very good estimates of what these forecasts are. When you talk to Wall Street about your earnings, it goes right along with what they're expecting. When we went public in 2011, it was a little silly game. I said, let's write the earnings script, and we will be successful if 3 years from now, we're just filling in the blanks. The script doesn't change at all. We're just putting in the new numbers because this business model is so compelling. And then the final slide here, and then we'll do a couple questions at least. When we think about employee engagement, there's lots of different surveys. We use Culture Amp. I love Culture Amp. It's really good. But I've kind of boiled it down to these few things. First and foremost, employees will be engaged, and these are all necessary but not sufficient. Collectively, I think they're sufficient. If people say, I trust and enjoy the people I work with, and they say, I feel productive and well supported in my job, I'm producing things with a certain ease, I get to do what I do best every day, I'm proud of what we create, so there's a deliverables piece. How do you feel about what you're creating? Then what results are you seeing as a company and individual? So if the individual says, the company is very successful and I see my career and my personal growth advancing, that's really big. And then finally, what does it all mean? Hey, does this really make a difference in the world? But if you start with people, and I've never been in any of my experiences, and I hope someday I will, where we got really good scores across all five. The companies I've been part of are almost always really good at purpose and always good at people, and it's kind of messy in between. But this is what I just think is like, okay, if this is true, then you can have a really great culture. And so right now at Coursera, we're seeing great results, and purpose is awesome. People are fantastic. The workflow and deliverables is where we're focused right now, and this happens a lot when you're scaling pretty quickly. It gets a little messy. So that's it. We've got a time for one or two questions. I will just sort of emphasize that the job of a CEO, a growth CEO, is to learn, change, and grow as an organization, but it really starts with, as a person, a commitment to some level of humility and recognition that you're never really good enough to deserve the job. You know, your job is to really make sure that you're learning and changing and growing as a person to serve the people and the mission of your company. So thank you. Yeah, maybe just two questions.
What are your most valuable tools for learning how to grow, and how did those change from earlier in your career versus now?
Yeah, so the question is, what are the most valuable tools to learning and growing? I'd say there's kind of two. The biggest one for sure is people who I respect, getting feedback from them. So my wife, my kids, and the people that report to me, if they say something, it makes a big impact on me because I want to serve them. So getting feedback from people that you respect is, for me, number one. And number two is reading books. You know, I get a little addicted to the news every now and again, but if you think about it, how much value and insight is deep in these books of the most brilliant people in the world. I think substantial transformation of thinking happens when you can bring to bear on your mind some of the best thinking from some of the best thinkers. So I like to, if I could not give up everything else but those two things, it would be feedback from people I trust and really good books by really smart people. One more? Yeah.
Your annual presentation to your employees, what do you talk about? Is it results or is it?
So we actually, the question is your annual presentation to the employees, what do we talk about? So we meet every other week. And we have a little, yeah, I think what you want to do, personally, my first principles would be hit those parts of employee engagement. Talk about the people, celebrate the people, talk about what you're accomplishing in the world, always come back to the vision and show the success and also the learning. Like this is where we're succeeding and this is where we're not. Because I think a lot of what people want to know is we're realizing the vision that makes me come here and we're doing it with a certain level of sort of humility and learning that makes me feel like this is a dynamic place. I don't want to cut too much into the next speaker, so thank you guys very much for coming.